he insults Jesus. I mean, you think, oh, well, we're calling him a prophet, so we're respecting him. But if you look at what you actually claim about Jesus, he turns out to be the most epic failure in the history of the prophets. I mean, he came, he won all these followers who converted to Islam, and then everything fell apart because he did such a horrible job. Everything is corrupted. He couldn't win a single lasting convert. And that's what you really teach about Jesus. And so you claim to be respecting him, and yet as soon as we dig beneath the surface, we find all kinds of blasphemy.
All right, so this is going to be another part of Refuting Apuss and David Wood's 10 questions for Muslims. Does Islam insult Jesus? No, and my response is no, it doesn't. Now let me go back to the points you brought up here. 1 second here. All right, he says according to Islam, Jesus came. Yeah, according to Christianity, Jesus came too. So Christianity and Islam are in agreement. Jesus came into the world by, the virgin birth, according to the New Testament and the Quran. Okay, so we can agree on that point. Second point, some people followed him. Again, yes, according to the New Testament, Jesus had 12 disciples, or he had many more according to the Gospel of Luke. A lot of people did. Some people did follow Jesus. That's correct. Jesus had followers according to the Quran and according to the New Testament. So yeah, we're in agreement there. Allah promised to elevate his followers. Now, what does the Quran mean by this? I think he's referring to the Quran, chapter 61, if I'm remembering correctly. But if you read the commentary, if you read Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, Tafsir of Ibn Abbas, Tafsir means, the commentary of Ibn Kathir, the commentary of Ibn Abbas. The promise to elevate his followers was that these people were superior to the non-believers or the non-Christians, so to speak, because they believed in Jesus. It doesn't mean the whole message was preserved with them. And when the Quran is saying that, it's praising these followers, it's praising their. It's saying that that Muhammad's religion, Muhammad was coming, that these people knew of the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, or they knew the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad who was to come, and that's why those people were elevated, because they had knowledge of a future prophet. That's the correct exegesis, or that's the correct commentary on the Quran, chapter 61. The fourth point he says is no true followers were known. Well, who spread Christianity? Who was the most successful missionary of Christianity? It wasn't the disciples, it was Paul. We read in Galatians 1 that Paul said that he got the information of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection not through human origin, but by revelations. Again, read Galatians 1, read Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 to 12. Paul says here, let me pull up that verse, because that verse is very important here. 1 second here. Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 to 12. Galatians chapter 1, verse 11. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. This is Paul talking. Galatians chapter 1, verse 12. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, notice what Paul is saying. Paul is saying that he didn't get the crucifixion and resurrection, or the gospel, from the disciples. He says, I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, meaning the disciples or the apostles, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ. The Greek word for revelation is apocalypso, which means revelation or vision or manifestation. So Paul got it from a vision of Jesus Christ. So why should we believe Paul? And if we read 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 5, I believe, Paul uses the same word. What I received, I passed on to you. So he received the gospel by his own revelations, and not from the disciples, or not from human origin, as Paul himself says. So Paul is the founder of Christianity, not the disciples. So the disciples didn't write down anything, and none of the disciples were successful in preaching Christianity. The most successful Christian missionary was Paul. He was the one who propagated Jesus' death and resurrection, not the disciples, according to Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 to 12, 1 Corinthians 15, etc. Jesus' message was lost. Well, yes, that's true, because if you read if you read scholarship, right, if you read what these scholars have to say, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written after Jesus. Even conservative scholars, Craig L. Blomberg, Raymond Brown, in his book Introduction to the New Testament, state that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by anonymous Greek authors. Jesus never spoke Greek; he spoke Aramaic. And then later on, people said, "Yeah, this gospel was written by Matthew. Yeah, this gospel was written by Mark, etc., etc." Those names were put in there in the 2nd century. So, yes, Jesus' message was lost. That's true, because even Christian scholars are admitting that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are of unknown authorship and of unknown sources. So that means whatever the real Jesus was teaching does not reflect or isn't really found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, of course, Jesus' message was lost. The disciples were not successful in preaching their version of Christianity or their version of Jesus' teachings. It was Paul who propagated the crucifixion and resurrection using, the Old Testament and his own revelations or his own visions. Read Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 to 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 6, etc. So just read those verses and you'll see that Paul was the most successful Christian missionary out there. And if we read the New Testament, we read that Paul and the disciples got into fights with one another. They weren't preaching the same thing. How do I know this? We know this by just reading the New Testament carefully. 1 second here. Let me just get into that right now. We read in 1 second here. Okay, yeah. We read in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. This is Paul talking in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. For if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preach, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or a different gospel from the one you accept, you put up with it easy enough. But I do not think I am least inferior to these super apostles. So Paul is again criticizing the disciples, or he's saying that there are people preaching another Jesus and another Jesus or a different Jesus than what he's preaching. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 22 to 24. Paul says, "What anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am out of my mind to talk like this. I am more." So Paul is saying that he worked harder than that, or Paul is basically criticizing the disciples of Jesus. He's saying that he's saying that his version of Christianity or his version of the gospel is the true gospel. Because he says a different spirit from the one you received, or a different gospel from what you accept. So there are people preaching another Jesus than what Paul was preaching. So what was Paul preaching? Jesus was crucified and resurrected. So Paul is saying there are people who are preaching that another Jesus. That means Jesus was not killed or resurrected according to their gospel. He says, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I." So Paul is basically saying that he's better than all the disciples, or he's criticizing the disciples, or the disciples, or the apostles of the disciples, and these people, Paul and the disciples, were not getting along in terms of theology, or they were preaching different things about Jesus. So Paul is the one who was the most successful missionary, and Paul says in 2 2 Timothy and Romans, my gospel. What is Paul's gospel? Jesus' resurrection, or I'm sorry, Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And the disciples were teaching something different than that, according to 2 Corinthians, the verse that I just cited in 2 Corinthians. So, of course, Jesus' message was lost. You just read the New Testament and we know that's true. And Paul is important because Paul was writing before the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, before the other writings of the New Testament. So this is very important. So yeah, I mean, what Islam teaches is actually found in the pages of the New Testament. If you read 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, etc., it says that, the earliest generation was saying that the Gospels were myths, and the author of 2 Peter is trying to push back against that. So the earliest followers of Jesus were saying that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus was seen as a myth, or a cleverly devised myth, according to 2 Peter, etc., etc. So again, Islam does not teach anything different than what the New Testament teaches. The New Testament, according to the New Testament, Jesus is a prophet. Jesus himself says that he is a prophet. Let me get that verse right now in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 4. The people around Jesus say that Jesus is a prophet. Jesus confirmed that he was a prophet. See Matthew chapter 13, verse 57. The people knew Jesus was a prophet. See Matthew chapter 16, verse 14. Gospel of Matthew chapter 21, verse 11. The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Jesus was the woman in Samaria knew that Jesus was a prophet. Gospel of John chapter 4, verse 19. Notice how the people and the woman aren't saying Jesus is a prophet and he's the Son of God and he's God. No, they just say he's a prophet only. Read John chapter 4, verse 19. Matthew chapter 21, verse 11. Matthew chapter 13, verse 57. Jesus identifies himself as a prophet, according to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, verse 57. The blind man that Jesus healed recognizes that Jesus was a prophet. Gospel of John chapter 9, verse 17. What else here? So you get my point that according to even the New Testament Gospels itself, Jesus identified himself as a prophet. Again, the Quran is not saying anything. The Quran is not saying anything new here. So when the Quran or when the New Testament say Jesus is the Son of God, well, Adam was the Son of God according to the New Testament. David was the Son of God. Israel was the Son of God. So the Son of God was a very human term. So when Jesus is identified as the Son of God, that's a very human term. Even when Jesus says he's the Son of Man, according to the Gospel of Mark chapter 14, Gospel of Mark chapter 14 or 15, whatever it is, Ezekiel also says he's the Son of Man. Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 1, Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 1, Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 1, Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 1. Son of Man is emphasizing the humanity of a person, as Ezekiel himself was saying. So the Quran is not saying anything new about Jesus. It's whatever the Quran is saying, it's found in the pages of the New Testament itself. So yes, the disciples were not successful in preaching their version of Christianity. Paul was, and Jesus' message was lost. Whoever wrote the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't know anything about the disciples, didn't know anything about Jesus, because according to Christian scholars themselves, Raymond Brown, Craig L. Blomberg, etc., the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written by anonymous Greek authors, or they were written anonymously by anonymous Greek Christians living outside of where Jesus lived. So who knows what Jesus really said and what Jesus really taught, just using the New Testament itself, because those sources are unreliable according to conservative scholars themselves, according to Christian scholars themselves are admitting this. So yeah, the Quran's not saying anything new about Jesus. You can find everything about what the Quran says about Jesus in the pages of the New Testament itself. So, the Quran's not saying anything different from what the New Testament is saying. I'm going to be refuting a little bit more of these videos, but this is just so the Quran is not in error or the Quran does not insult Jesus in any way. The Quran says he's a prophet. The New Testament agrees. The Quran says he's the Messiah. The New Testament agrees. The Quran says the Quran praises Jesus in the Quran chapter 3, etc. The New Testament itself praises Jesus. So Islam is not insulting Jesus. It's praising Jesus, and it's saying, look, whatever the Quran is saying, you can find it in the New Testament itself. So the Quran is not saying anything new about Jesus. It's saying the truth about Jesus, which you can find in the pages of the New Testament itself. As for the crucifixion, I believe Jesus was crucified, but I don't think he died on the cross, and that vindicates the Quran chapter 4, verse 157. And I think that Jesus was raised from the tomb into heaven. Because if you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nobody sees Jesus get resurrected. No one sees Jesus rise from the dead. Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 16 is largely seen as a fabrication, or is seen as a fabrication, or was these verses were in the original Gospel of Mark, the original Codex Vaticanus of Mark, of the original manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. So if we read the Q Gospel, the Q Gospel predates the New Testament, the entire New Testament. Even Paul, Jesus was talking about his assumption into heaven and not his resurrection. So the Quran is not saying anything new about Jesus. It's not insulting Jesus. It's saying things that you can find in the Q Gospel and in the Gospels or in the New Testament writings itself. It's Paul. If anyone corrupted, or if anybody was successful in preaching their version of Christianity, it's Paul and not the disciples, because Paul got his gospel from revelations in the Old Testament, according to Galatians 1, chapter 11. Galatians chapter 1 verses 11 to 12, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 to 6, etc., etc. So no, Islam does not insult Jesus. Islam praises Jesus and tells the truth about him, which you can find, which is backed up according to the pages of the New Testament. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead.